The neighborhood was designed to feel controlled long before anyone ever read the HOA rules. The streets curved gently, discouraging traffic. The lawns were trimmed to near-identical lengths. Mailboxes matched in color and placement, standing like quiet sentries of conformity. Even the silence felt regulated, as if noise itself had been measured and approved by committee. It was the kind of place marketed as safe, orderly, and prestigious, where problems were supposed to be filtered out by structure and authority. At the center of that structure sat the Homeowners Association, an entity that claimed to exist for protection but thrived on compliance. Its presence was everywhere and nowhere at once. Notices arrived politely worded but unmistakably firm. Emails carried cheerful greetings followed by thinly veiled threats of fines. Most residents learned early that peace here didn't come from freedom, but from obedience.
But residents have
For a long
concerns about the
time,
cost.
it
The
worked.
survey supports it. We're
Life in the
proceeding.
neighborhood followed a predictable rhythm. Mornings began with synchronized garage doors rising and falling. Afternoons were quiet enough to hear sprinklers ticking. Evenings settled into a calm that felt rehearsed. People waved, smiled, and avoided lingering conversations that might drift into complaints. Everyone knew the unspoken rule: don't attract attention. The HOA thrived in that atmosphere. Among the board members, one figure stood out. She wasn't the president, but she didn't need the title. Her authority came from visibility and persistence. She walked the neighborhood daily, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning for violations others had learned not to see. She enforced rules not with restraint, but enthusiasm. To her, compliance wasn't just a duty, it was a personal standard she believed everyone else had failed to meet. Over time, residents learned her patterns. She favored certain homes, ignored others, and seemed especially alert to anything involving guests. Unfamiliar cars drew her attention. Laughter carried too long into the evening earned notes on doors. Small gatherings became targets for scrutiny. Still, most people endured it quietly. They told themselves it was easier not to resist. That mindset held until the night the police arrived. The gathering itself was unremarkable. A handful of guests, known faces, parked legally along the curb. The house lights were warm, the atmosphere relaxed. It was nothing more than an ordinary evening that happened countless times in other neighborhoods without consequence. There was no shouting, no music spilling into the street, no disorder. Yet within minutes, patrol cars appeared at the end of the block. Their presence transformed the night instantly. Flashing lights reflected off windshields and windows, pulling neighbors to their curtains. The calm dissolved into tension. The visit didn't last long, but its impact lingered. The reason for the call was vague, framed around concerns that didn't match reality. The officers left as quickly as they arrived, their job done, their time wasted. What mattered wasn't what happened during the visit. It was what it represented. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the first visible escalation in a pattern that had been quietly forming. The HOA, or more specifically its most aggressive enforcer, had crossed an invisible line. The rules had always been intrusive, but now they had brought law enforcement into something that never required it. The next morning, the neighborhood returned to its routine as if nothing had happened. Lawns were watered. Cars departed on schedule. Smiles were exchanged. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. Within days, an official notice arrived. It referenced community standards, guest limits, and vague behavioral expectations. There was no mention of the police, no acknowledgement of the seriousness of what had occurred. The message was clear without being stated: this was a warning. The realization came slowly, settling in piece by piece. The HOA wasn't responding to a problem. It was creating one. The police call wasn't about safety, it was about intimidation. It was a demonstration of reach, a reminder that the HOA could escalate matters beyond fines and letters if it chose to. Once that truth became clear, other moments resurfaced with new meaning. Previous warnings that felt excessive. The way certain neighbors were left alone while others were scrutinized relentlessly. The timing of enforcement actions that always seemed to coincide with gatherings or questions directed at the board. The pattern was no longer ignorable. The HOA's power rested on two pillars: fear and ignorance. Fear kept residents compliant. Ignorance kept them from asking how the association actually operated. Most people paid their dues, followed the rules, and never questioned where the money went or how decisions were made. That night shattered the illusion of neutrality. If the HOA was willing to involve police over nothing, then its leadership wasn't acting in good faith. That kind of confidence didn't come from righteousness. It came from believing no one would ever look too closely. The idea of looking deeper didn't begin as a plan. It began as a question. What gave them the certainty that they could act this way without consequence? The answer, whatever it was, had to be hidden somewhere. And hidden things always leave traces. From that point forward, everything was observed differently. Notices were saved instead of discarded. Emails were archived instead of skimmed. Timelines were reconstructed. Patterns were noted. Small details that once felt insignificant began to align into something larger. The neighborhood itself started to feel like a stage set, orderly on the surface, rigidly controlled, and carefully managed to prevent scrutiny. The HOA meetings, once sparsely attended, appeared intentionally dull, designed to discourage participation. Financial summaries were brief and technical, offering just enough information to appear compliant without revealing substance. The more attention was paid, the clearer it became that the police call was not a reaction, but a tactic. And tactics are used for a reason. That realization marked the true beginning of the story. Not the night of flashing lights, but the moment the belief in the HOA's legitimacy cracked. What had once been accepted as authority was now seen as something far more fragile. Power that depends on silence cannot survive curiosity. As the neighborhood settled back into its carefully maintained calm, a quiet decision took shape. The rules would still be followed. The notices would still arrive. The enforcer would continue her rounds, convinced of her dominance. But behind the scenes, something irreversible had begun. The HOA had revealed its willingness to abuse power. And that meant it had something to hide. The neighborhood was designed to feel controlled long before anyone ever read the HOA rules. But the illusion of normalcy required effort. Gently, discouraging traffic continued. Yet the lawns were trimmed to near as if everyone was performing their role to avoid drawing color and placement. What once seemed like peaceful now felt restrained. Silence no longer felt regulated, as if noise itself had been measured and approved by committee. The HOA understood this dynamic well. It was the kind of place marketed as safe, orderly, and prestigious, but on conditioning. Where problems were supposed to be filtered out by structure and authority, not by reading the bylaws. At the center of that structure sat the homeowners association, an entity that claimed to exist for protection but thrived on unpredictable, and often its presence was everywhere and nowhere. That uncertainty kept people cautious. Notices arrived politely worded, at the center of this system stood the board. A small group of volunteers who wielded outsized influence over daily lives. Meetings were technically early that peace participation was discouraged through scheduling, tone, and for a long time, it worked. Financial matters were summarized in the neighborhood followed a predictable rhythm. Technical language. Mornings began with synchronized garage doors with minimal discussion. Afternoons were quiet enough to hear the most aggressive board member thrived settled into a calm that felt rehearsed. She understood the power of process and the advantage of exhaustion, and avoided lingering conversations that might drift into complaints. She relied on paperwork, escalation, and external attention. Police calls were just one extension of that strategy, among the way to reinforce authority without appearing personally involved. She wasn't the president, the impact on targeted homeowners was subtle but corrosive. Her authority came from visibility and persistence. Each fine, she walked the neighborhood away at a sense of security in hand. Scanning for violations others had learned not to see. Parking required calculation. She enforced rules not with restraint, small deviations from routine felt risky. To her, compliance wasn't just pressure reshaped behavior. It was a personal standard. People stopped inviting friends over. Failed to meet. They avoided community spaces. Residents learned her pattern. They chose silence over engagement. She favored certain homes. This environment didn't arise overnight. Seemed especially alert to anything involving guests. Through years of unchallenged enforcement drew her acceptance. Laughter carried too long into the evening that the rules applied equally. Small gatherings became targets for community's best interest. Still, but the reality was more uneven. They told themselves it was easier not to receive notices, despite that mindset held until the night the police arrived. Certain residents spoke. The gathering itself was without consequence. A handful of guests, scrutiny for the smallest infractions, parked legally along the inconsistency wasn't accidental. The house lights were warm. The atmosphere reflected relationships. It was nothing more than an ordinary evening that happened countless times in other neighborhoods without consequence. Parking. There was no shouting, no music spilling into the street. The HOA had positioned itself as the sole authority capable of maintaining order of the block, and any challenge to that narrative was treated as disruption. Flashing lights reflected off windshields and windows, transparency was treated as inconvenience. The calm dissolved had amplified these dynamics. The visit didn't last long, but it demonstrated that the HOA was willing to escalate beyond its own jurisdiction, framed around using external institutions to enforce compliance. The officers left as quickly as they arrived, the power balance dramatically. Their time wasted. What had once been administrative harassment now carried the weight of legal consequence. It was what it represented, even when unfounded. This wasn't an isolated incident. This realization was the first visible escalation in a pattern that had been eroded quickly. Replaced by vigilance and more specifically its most interaction with the HOA had crossed an invisible line. The rules had always been intrusive, but now they had quiet anxiety shared by many but never required few. Behind this tension lay another struggle, returned to its less visible but nothing consequential. Lawns were watered, HOA's operations were opaque by design. Dues were collected regularly, yet few residents could articulate how that money was spent. Within maintenance decisions appeared arbitrary. Fees increased without corresponding improved limits, and requests for detailed explanations were met with delays or dismissive responses. No acknowledgement of the transparency fed a growing suspicion. The message was clear without being confident enough to involve police over minor issues. The realization came slowly, settling in piece by piece. That confidence suggested insulation from accountability. It was creating residents either wouldn't notice. The police call wasn't about safety. The internal struggle shifted from frustration. It was a demonstration of reach. The question was no longer whether the HOA's behavior was beyond fines and letters if it chose untouchable. Once that truth question led inevitably to finance resurface, governance, and oversight. Previous warnings understanding the HOA's structure became essential. The way certain neighbors were left alone while others were scrutinized relentlessly. State regulations were reviewed. The timing of enforcement actions that always seemed to coincide with gatherings or questions directed at the board. What emerged was no longer what the HOA was obligated to do and what it actually practiced. Fear and the realization was unsettling. Fear kept residents compliant. The association wasn't just overreaching from asking how the association actually operated, relying on resident apathy to avoid scrutiny. Followed the rules. The board's authority was real, where the money went or accountability was minimal. That this context reframed every previous encounter. If the HOA was willing to involve police over nothing, the police calls were no longer isolated incidents. In good faith. They were symptoms of a deeper imbalance, come from righteousness. One that benefited those in power. It came from believing no one would ever look too closely. The struggle now extended beyond a single homeowner. Didn't begin as a plan. It reflected a community constrained by an institution that gave them the certainty that they could act this way without consequence. The HOA had become less about maintenance and more about dominance. Had to be less about standards and more about hidden things always leave traces. As this understanding solidified forward, everything was observed differently. The fear that notices were saved instead of replaced by clarity. Emails were the underlying struggles of the neighborhood were timelines were reconstructed. They were measurable, documented. Small details that once felt insignificant began to align into groundwork had been laid. The neighborhood itself started to feel like a stage set. Comprehension was necessary. Rigidly controlled the system meant understanding its weaknesses. And the HOA meeting, once identified, had a way of reshaping intentionally dull, designed to discourage participation. Financial summaries were brief and technical, offering just enough information to appear compliant without revealing substance. The more attention was paid, the clearer it became that the police call was not a reaction, but a tactic. And tactics are used for a reason. That realization marked the true beginning of the story. Not the night of flashing lights, but the moment the belief in the HOA's legitimacy cracked. What had once been accepted as authority was now seen as something far more fragile. Power that depends on silence cannot survive curiosity. As the neighborhood settled back into its carefully maintained calm, a quiet decision took shape. The rules would still be followed. The notices would still arrive. The enforcer would continue her rounds, convinced of her dominance. But behind the scenes, something irreversible had begun. The HOA had revealed its willingness to abuse power. And that meant it had something to hide. The neighborhood was designed to feel controlled long before anyone ever read the HOA rules. It spread quietly, the streets curved gently through the neighborhood in subtle ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. What had once been a collection of individual frustrations began to feel like a shared emotional weight. People didn't speak openly about it, yet their behavior itself had been measured and approved. Conversations ended quickly when HOA place marketed as safe, orderly, contact and lingered a second longer than problems were supposed to be filtered out by structure and others felt the same unease. At the center of that structure, center of the recent police call became an entity that claimed to exist for protection, not a symbol of rebellion, but of vulnerability. Its presence was everywhere and nowhere residents that compliance offered notices no arrived politely worded. If something as ordinary as hosting guests emails carried cheerful greetings followed by thinly veiled threats of fines. The fear that had once been abstract became personal. Peace here didn't come from freedom, created an emotional bridge between neighbors who had previously kept their distance. Life in the neighborhood followed a predictable rhythm. Has a way of began with synchronized garage small doors gestures began to appear. Afternoons were quiet enough to hear sprinklers. A brief comment about evening settled into a calm that passing remark about how enforcement seemed to be getting worse and avoided lingering conversations that might drift into cracks in the silence. Everyone knew the emotional impact extended beyond embarrassment or frustration. The HOA thrived in that into the sense of home itself. Among the board members, a house is meant to be a refuge. A place where control and comfort coexist. But she didn't need the title. When external authority intrudes without visibility and the sense of safety arose. She walked the neighborhood's manicured appearance could not hide the anxiety for violations others had learned not to see. For those directly targeted, rules not with the emotional toll but enthusiasm. Every guest invitation compliance wasn't just a duty, Every personal standard she believed everyone else had failed to meet. The anticipation of another notice or call became a low-level constant. Patterns. A background noise that never fully disappeared. Ignored others. This kind of pressure didn't explode. Alert to anything involving guests. Slowly reshaping daily life drew her attention. What made it particularly corrosive was the lack of recourse. Notes on doors. The HOA presented small gatherings became targets for scrutiny. Complaints went unanswered. Most people endured appeals vanished into procedural. They told themselves it was easier not to resist. The system seemed designed not to resolve issues, held until the night the police raised them. The gathering itself was under a quiet sense of injustice. A handful of guests, it wasn't dramatic or loud, parked legally along the curb. The realization that authority was being misused created a moral tension. It was nothing more than an ordinary evening that happened countless times in other neighborhoods without consequence. They could endure. There was no shouting, no music spilling into the street. What they struggled with was arbitrary power. Yet within minutes, as this awareness spread, it began to alter how residents saw one another. Their presence transformed the night. The HOA had thrived on division, lights reflected off windshields and windows, pulling neighbors to their curtain. But shared emotional experience eroded that isolation. The visit didn't last long, began to recognize patterns in each other's stories. The reason for the call was vague, names appeared framed around concerns that didn't match reality. The same board member signed the warning. The officers left as quickly as they arrived. The same escalation tactics repeated themselves. Their time wasted. These realizations wasn't what happened during the visit, but they built empathy. It was what it represented. Understanding replaced judgment. This wasn't an isolated incident. The neighbor once seen as problematic was now viewed as escalation in a pattern that had been quietly forming. The homeowner labeled difficult was recognized as questioning a system that resisted aggressive enforcer. The emotional bridge extended inward as well. The rules had always been intrusive. The initial response to the police call had been anger, enforcement quickly followed by embarrassment. Required. Over time, the next morning, those feelings the neighborhood returned to its routine as if nothing had happened. Anger without direction fades. Lawns were watered, but anger paired with understanding becomes purpose. Smiles were exchanged. This transformation wasn't immediate. But beneath that surface, doubt lingered. Something had shifted. The risk of retaliation was real. An official notice arrived. The HOA had demonstrated its willingness to escalate, challenging it openly could invite further expectations. The emotional bridge between fear and action had to be acknowledgement of the seriousness of what crossing began with validation. The message was clear without being stated. That the reaction to the situation was justified, the realization not came slowly, settling in understanding that discomfort was a rational response to abuse of authority. It was this internal validation mattered. The police call wasn't about safety. Relied on it was about intimidation control. It was a demonstration of reach, their own perceptions, a reminder that the HOA were less likely to challenge matters beyond fines and letters. As confidence grew, so did once curiosity. Truth became clear, other moments resurfaced with new meaning. Instead of asking why the HOA behaved this way, the way certain neighbors were left alone while others were scrutinized. Emotional energy that had been drained by stress was redirected into observation coincide with gatherings or questions directed at the board. Subtly shifted again. The pattern was no longer ignorable. Calm remained. The HOA's power rested on two pillars. Fear and ignorance. The HOA's actions no longer went unnoticed or unquestioned. Ignorance kept them from asking how the association actually operated. This emotional groundwork was essential. Most people paid their dues, facts alone rarely drive change, and never questioned where the money went or how decisions were made. On those facts. That night shattered the illusion of neutrality. Injustice. If the HOA was willing to involve numbers without impact, then its leadership wasn't acting also connected past and present. That kind of confidence residents recalled earlier incidents that had once seemed isolated. No one would ever look too closely. A neighbor who moved away abruptly. The idea of looking family didn't begin attending gatherings. It began as a question who had spoken up at a meeting and then disappeared from community without consequence. These memories, reinterpreted through the current lens, revealed a pattern of suppression. And hidden things always leave traces. Understanding that pattern created a sense of responsibility. Everything was observed differently. Remaining silent, notices were saved instead of discarded. It felt complicit. Emails were archived. This realization didn't demand confrontation. Timelines were reconstructed, but it demanded attention. Patterns were noted. Within the house at the center of the story, once the emotional shift began to align into something larger. What had begun as a reaction to a single incident evolved into a broader awareness of role. On the surface, being targeted inadvertently, carefully managed home in a position of visibility. The HOA meetings, once sparsely attended, to see what would happen next. Intentionally dull. That awareness carried weight. Discouraged participation. It required balance. Financial summaries were brief and technical, not only one offering just enough information to might suffer retaliation by associations. The more attention was reinforced, the clearer it became that the police call was not a reaction, bridge between but a personal grievance and collective impact used for a reason. That realization had to be the true beginning of the story, and resilient. Not the night of flashing emotion lights, would fuel the moment the belief strategy would guide legitimacy cracked. By the end of this phase, what had once been neighborhood as authority was now seen as something far more still trimmed. Power that depends on silence cannot survive curiosity. Still patrolled with confidence. As the neighborhood settled back into its fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. A quiet decision took shape. The HOA's power was no longer be followed. The notices would still arrive. Confrontation could not. The enforcer would continue her rounds, people, validated experience, and transformed fear into focus. Something irreversible. The bridge had been built. The HOA had revealed its willingness to isolation to awareness, and that meant it had something to hide. There was no returning to ignorance. The neighborhood was designed to action did not happen before anyone ever read the HOA through a series of small, deliberate steps that steadily increased pressure on the HOA while exposing its fragility lengths. What had once been mailboxes matched in color and closer to the surface, standing like carried by centuries of conformity. The association even the silence felt regulated, as the HOA responded measured and approved by committee. As scrutiny increased, it was the kind of place marketed as safe, orderly, notices arrived more frequently, where problems were more detailed and severe than the structure and authority. Fines escalated. At the center of that structure sat the homeowners association, the language used in communication to exist for protection, stripped of the polite neutrality that once masked its presence was everywhere and nowhere. These changes were meant to reassert notices arrived politely to remind residents that resistance would be met with consequence. Emails carried cheerful greetings followed by thinly veiled threats. Instead of retreating into silence, most residents learned early that peace here didn't come from freedom, but the volume of enforcement made the disparity impossible to ignore. Life in the neighborhood was cited predictable rhythm, always targeting the same with synchronized garage doors rising and falling. The pattern was now visible not just to those affected, quiet enough to hear observers who had once felt immune. Evenings settled into a calm that felt rehearsed, though they grew less effective as a tool of intimidation, and avoided lingering conversations that might drift the situation, and left without incident. Everyone knew the unspoken rule. The spectacle lost its attention. What remained was a record in that atmosphere. Documented misuse of emergency resources. One figure stood out. The growing case against the HOA. She wasn't the president, but behind the scenes, title. Preparation her authority came from visibility and financial records had been analyzed. The neighborhood daily. Governance failures were documented. Eyes scanning for violations. Legal obligations were cross-referenced with actual practices. She enforced rules not with restraint. What emerged was a comprehensive portrait of an association. Compliance wasn't just a mandate. It was a personal standard she believed everyone else had failed to meet. The decision to bring the challenge into residents' view was made carefully. She favored certain homes, credibility mattered, and seemed especially alert to provoke a reaction involving guests, but to reveal truth in a way that could not drew her attention. The first to carry too long into the evening earned notes on doors. Written demands for transparency were submitted in accordance with state law. Most people endured it quietly. They told themselves it was easy enough to resist. Interest statements were precise. That mindset held until the night the police arrived. They followed procedure meticulously. The gathering itself leaving was no room for dismissal on technical grounds. A handful of guests, known faces, the HOA's response was defensive and delayed. The house lights were warm. The atmosphere relaxed. Documents were released. It was nothing more than an ordinary evening that happened countless times in other neighborhoods without referencing legal review, and there was no shouting, no music spilling into the street, worked in the past, no disorder. But now they only heightened suspicion. Patrol cars as the situation escalated. Residents began to transform the night instantly. Conversations that once ended abruptly now extended. Windows, shared experiences were compared. The count dissolved into tension. Patterns were confirmed. The visit didn't last long. The HOA's attempt to isolate individuals. The reason for the call was vague. The emotional bridges built earlier now supported collective awareness. The officers left as quickly as they arrived. The public challenge intensified at the next HOA meeting. Wasted. Attendance surged. Wasn't what happened during the visit. Who had never spoken. It was what it represented. This wasn't an isolated incident. The atmosphere shifted from visible escalation in a pattern that had been quietly forming. The board, accustomed to passive audiences, or more specifically its most aggressive enforcer, questions about finances, enforcement. The rules had always been intrusive, and police involvement. But now they had brought law enforcement. The Karen's authority never required. Once unchallenged, the next morning, the neighborhood her explanations routine previously accepted without question. Lawns were now sounded rehearsed. Cars departed on schedule. The confidence she projected could not mask the discomfort beneath that surface. The meeting did not resolve anything. Within days, an official notice arrived. It demonstrated that the HOA's power depended on compliance and vague behavioral expectations. Once that there was no mention of the police, authority wavered. No acknowledgement of the seriousness of what had occurred. The HOA attempted. The message was clear without being stated. Emails were sent emphasizing unity and community. The realization came slowly. New committees were announced piece by piece. Promises of future transparency were made without specifics. It was creating these gestures. The police call wasn't about safety. Instead underscored about intimidation. The board was for genuine. It was a demonstration of reach. The tension reached a new level when external oversight beyond fines and letters if it chose. Complaints were filed with regulatory bodies. Clear. Each other moments recensored documentation. Previous warnings shifted the challenge beyond the neighborhood. The way certain neighbors were left alone while others were scrutinized relentlessly. Media interest enforcement actions that always seemed to coincide with neighborhood gatherings or questions directed at the board, misusing police resources was no longer and obscuring financial practices resonated beyond the community. Fear inquiries arrived. Fear kept residents requested. The HOA's action from asking how the association actually operated became subject to public scrutiny. Followed the rules. Role became never questioned where the money went or how decisions were made. Repeatedly in documents, that night shattered the illusion of neutrality and enforcement actions. If the HOA was willing to involve as diligence now appeared as overreach, its leadership wasn't acting in good faith. Once intimidating, that kind of confidence didn't come from righteousness, not control. It came from believing no one would ever look too close to residents. The idea of looking deeper to the board began as a plan. Meetings began as a question. Internal
What gave them the
disagreement
certainty
surfaced.
that they could act this
Board
way without
members
consequence?
distanced themselves from
The
decisions
answer,
they had
whatever
previously
it was,
supported.
had to be hidden
The unity
somewhere.
that once
And
shielded
hidden
the
things
HOA
always
began
leave
to
traces.
fracture. From
Despite
that point
these
forward,
developments,
everything
the
was
public
observed
challenge
differently.
remained measured.
Notices
There
were
were no
saved
protests,
instead of discarded.
no shouting,
Emails
no
were
reckless
archived
accusations.
instead of skimmed. The strength
Timelines
of the
were
challenge lay in its
reconstructed.
restraint.
Patterns were
Facts
noted.
were allowed to speak.
Small details
Processes
that once
were
felt
followed.
insignificant
Evidence
began to align
accumulated.
into something larger.
This approach
The
denied
neighborhood
the
itself
HOA its
started to
preferred
feel like a
narrative.
stage set.
There was no
Orderly on
angry
the surface,
homeowner to discredit,
rigidly controlled,
no emotional
and carefully
outburst to
managed to
dismiss.
prevent scrutiny.
Instead,
The
there was a
HOA
consistent,
meetings,
documented
sparsely
pattern of
attended,
misconduct
appeared
that demanded
intentionally dull,
response.
designed
The
to
neighborhood
discourage
existed in a
participation.
state of suspended
Financial
anticipation.
summaries were brief and
Everyone
technical,
sensed that a
offering
turning
just
point had
enough
been
information
reached.
to appear
The
compliant
HOA
without
could no
revealing
longer rely
substance.
on intimidation
The
alone.
more attention was
It
paid,
had been drawn
the
into
clearer
the
it
light,
became that the
where its
police
actions
call
would
was
be
not a
judged not
reaction,
by fear,
but a tactic,
but by standards
and
that had long
tactics are
ignored.
used for a reason.
The rising tension
That
marked the end
realization
of
marked the
secrecy.
true beginning of the
public
story.
challenge had begun,
Not the night of
and the
flashing
HOA's
lights,
carefully
but the moment
constructed
the belief
authority
in the
was beginning
HOA's
to crack under its own weight.
What had once been accepted as authority was now seen as something far more fragile. Power that depends on silence cannot survive curiosity. As the neighborhood settled back into its carefully maintained calm, a quiet decision took shape. The rules would still be followed. The notices would still arrive. The enforcer would continue her rounds, convinced of her dominance. But behind the scenes, something irreversible had begun. The HOA had revealed its willingness to abuse power. And that meant it had something to hide. The neighborhood was designed to feel controlled long before anyone ever read the HOA rules. It emerged quietly,
streets curved
almost
gently,
unnoticed,
discouraging
traffic. Buried within
The
documents
lawns were
that
trimmed
the
to
HOA
near
never
identical
expected
lengths.
anyone to read
Mailboxes
carefully.
matched in
What
color
made the
and
revelation
placement,
so
standing
powerful
like
was not
quiet
its centuries
spectacle,
of conformity,
but its inevitability.
Even the silence
Once
felt
seen,
regulated,
it could not
as
be
if noise
unseen.
itself had been
The
measured
initial
and
trigger
approved by
came from a
committee.
routine response
It was the
to
kind
one
of
of the
place
formal
marketed
disclosure
as safe,
requests.
orderly,
After
and
weeks of
prestigious,
delay,
where
the
problems
HOA
were supposed
released
to
a
be
partial
filtered
set
out
of
by
financial
structure and
records,
authority. Framed as
At the
evidence
center
of
of that
cooperation,
structure sat the
the
homeowners
documents were
association,
dense, an entity that claimed to
clearly
exist for
intended to
protection but
overwhelm
thrived
rather
on
than
compliance.
To the
Its
board,
presence was
this
everywhere
release
and
likely
nowhere
felt
at once.
sufficient.
Another
Notices
obstacle
arrived
placed in the
politely
path of
worded
scrutiny.
but unmistakably
Instead,
firm.
it became the
Emails
final
carried
piece.
cheerful greetings
Within
followed
those
by thinly
records was
veiled
a
threats
sequence of
fines.
transactions that did
Most
not align
residents
with
learned
the
early
HOA's
that
stated
peace here didn't
operations.
come from freedom,
The amounts
but from
were not
obedience.
insignificant.
For
but
a
they
long
were
time,
subtle enough
it
to
worked.
escape casual
Life
review.
in the neighborhood
Payments
followed a
repeated
predictable
across
rhythm.
multiple years.
Mornings
labeled
began with
under vague
synchronized
categories
garage
such as
doors rising and
consulting,
falling.
emergency
Afternoons
services,
were quiet
and
enough to hear
administrative
sprinklers
support.
ticking.
On their
Evenings
own,
settled
they
into a
appeared
calm that
routine.
felt rehearsed.
In context,
People waved,
they told a different
smiled,
story, and avoided
the same
lingering
vendor names
conversations
appeared
that
again
might
and
drift
again,
into complaints.
sometimes altered slightly,
Everyone knew
sometimes
the unspoken
abbreviated.
rule.
Don't attract
Addresses
attention.
linked back to the same
The HOA
locations.
thrived in that atmosphere.
Corporate registrations
Among the
revealed
board members,
overlapping ownership
one figure
structures.
stood out.
What
She
initially
wasn't the
looked like
president,
administrative
but she didn't need
redundancy
the title.
revealed itself as
Her
intentional
authority came from
obfuscation.
visibility and
The
persistence.
unexpected revelation
She
wasn't
walked the
just that
neighborhood
money had
daily,
been mishandled.
clipboard in hand.
It was
how
how
deeply
scanning
the
for
system
violations
had been
others had
designed to
learned not to
conceal it.
see. At
She
the center
enforced
of these
rules not with
transactions was a
restraint,
network
but
of shell
enthusiasm.
companies tied
To
indirectly
her,
to individuals
compliance wasn't
within
just
the
a duty,
HOA's leadership.
it was a personal
The
standard
connections
she
weren't
believed
obvious
everyone
at
else
first
had
glance,
failed to meet.
but they were there.
Over time,
woven carefully
residents
through layers
learned
of
her
bureaucracy.
She
Karen's
favored certain
involvement
homes,
surfaced
ignored
repeatedly,
others, not
and
always
seemed
as a
especially
direct
alert to
beneficiary,
anything
but
involving
as an
guests.
authorizer, a
Unfamiliar
facilitator,
cars drew
a
her
gatekeeper.
attention.
The
Laughter
realization
carried too long
landed
into
with a
the
quiet
evening earned
heaviness.
notes on doors.
This wasn't
Small
mismanagement
gatherings
born of
became targets
incompetence.
for scrutiny.
It was deliberate.
Still, most
The
people
HOA
endured it
had been
quietly.
operating a
They
parallel
told
system,
themselves it
one
was
that
easier not
benefited
to
the select
resist.
few while
That
presenting an
mindset
illusion
held
of
until the
collective
night the
maintenance
police
and
arrived.
order.
What
The
made the
gathering
revelation
itself was
truly
unremarkable.
unexpected was how it
A handful of
reframed
guests,
everything that had
known
come
faces,
before. Parked
the police
legally along
calls,
the curb,
the intimidation,
the house lights
the
were
selective
warm,
enforcement
the
all
atmosphere
took on
relaxed.
new meaning.
It was nothing
These
more
actions
than
were
an
not just
ordinary
about
evening
control.
that happened countless
They were
times in
about
other
protection,
neighborhoods without consequence.
distraction.
There was no
suppression.
shouting,
No
no
music
HOA
spilling
wasn't
into the
merely
street,
silencing
no
dissent to
disorder.
maintain authority.
Yet within minutes,
it was shielding
patrol
a
cars
financial
appeared at the
structure
end
that
of
could
the
not
block.
survive transparency.
Their presence transformed
As the
the night
scope of the
instantly.
discovery expanded,
Flashing lights
so did
reflected
its
off windshields
implications.
and windows.
The funds
pulling
diverted
neighbors to
through
their
these
curtains.
arrangements were
The
significant
calm
enough to
dissolved into
impact the
tension.
HOA's reserves.
The visit didn't last
explaining
long,
years of
but its
unexplained
impact
fee
lingered.
increases and
The
deferred
reason for the
maintenance.
call was vague, vague, projects framed around concerns that now had explanations. The officers left as quickly as they arrived, postponed were no longer mysteries, their time wasted. The emotional impact of this revelation during the visit. The neighborhood. It was what it had once felt like abstract injustice. This wasn't an isolated incident, tangible betrayal. It was the first visible escalation using good faith that had been quietly forming. Trusting the HOA to act as a steward of shared resources. Or more specifically, its most aggressive had been exploited systematically. An invisible line. The most unsettling aspect had always how long it had gone on, but now they had brought law enforcement into something that never required. The financial trail stretched back years.
The neighborhood returned to its routine as if nothing had come and gone. Lawns were watered, remained intact. Cars departed on schedule. It suggested that the system had been inherited, normalized, but beneath that quietly protected something had shifted. The Karen's role now stood in stark contrast to her public persona. It referenced her aggressive enforcement, guest limits, framed as dedication, behavioral expectations. There was no mention of the police, guardian no acknowledgement. She diverted attention from areas where disorder would have been far more without being stated. This was a revelation changed the realization came entirely, settling what had begun as a fight for fairness became a matter of accountability with legal consequences. It was creating one. The stakes escalated beyond neighborhood politics. It was about criminal liability. It was a demonstration of real careful handling. A reminder that the HOA information could not be released in fines and letters if it chose to. Accuracy mattered more than speed. Once the truth became clear, claims had to be resurfaced with every connection needed previous warnings that felt excessive. Every document needed the way certain neighbors were left during this while others were scrutinized relentlessly. Unaware of how the timing of enforcement actions that always seemed to coincide with gatherings or questions directly hollow. Board. Notices arrived, was no longer but they carried less weight. The HOA's power they once held had been stripped away by understanding. Behind the scenes, residents the revelation was shared strategically. Ignorance kept them from asking how the association actually operated. Regulatory agencies were updated, followed the rules, and never questioned whether the narrative presented was no longer about harassment or abuse shattered the illusion of neutrality. It was about financial misconduct. If the HOA was willing to involve intimidation over nothing, the response from oversight bodies was immediate and serious. That kind of confidence didn't come from righteousness. It came from believing no one would ever look too closely. Informal inquiries, the idea of looking deeper didn't begin as a plan. The HOA was no longer being asked to explain itself. What gave them the certainty that they could act this way without consequence? The neighborhood felt the change before it became whatever it was, had to be hidden somewhere. Diminished, and hidden things always became less frequent. From that communications grew cautious. Everything was observed differently. The confidence that once notices were saved instead of replaced by restraint. Emails were archived instead of postponed. Then timelines were reconstructed, postponed again. Patterns were noted. Internal fractures widened as members that once felt insignificant began to align into something larger. The unity that once protected the system collapsed under the weight of revelation. On the surface, when the information finally became known to residents, managed to prevent spread quietly at first. The HOA meetings, there were no dramatic announcements, attended, no celebratory reactions. Designed to discourage participation. The dominant emotion was disbelief. Financial summaries were brief and technical, not the explosive offering just enough information to appear steady outrage without revealing substance. The unexpected revelation did more than expose wrongdoing. That the police call was not a reaction, years of discomfort, fear, and tactics are used for a reason. It confirmed that the struggle had never been imagined or exaggerated. Not the night of flashing lights. This moment marked the point in the HOA's legitimacy. The HOA could no longer frame the narrative. Accepted as authority was now seen as something far more fragile. And it carried with it consequences that no amount of procedural cannot survive curiosity. What began as a single police call had led, carefully maintained calm, to the unquiet decision of a system built on secrecy. The rules would still be followed. The revelation was unexpected. The notices would still arrive. The enforcer would continue her rounds, everything, convinced of her dominance. And with that clarity came the certainty that the final reckoning was no longer a question of if, but the HOA had revealed its willingness to abuse power. And that meant it had something to hide. The neighborhood was designed to feel controls long before anyone ever read the HOA rules, deadlines, and consequences that unfolded methodically, stripping away the illusion of authority that had once defined the HOA. Mailboxes matched in color. Investigations moved standing like with a precision that mirrored the care used to uncover the truth. Even the silence felt regulated, were issued, as if noise itself had been measured and approved by vendors were questioned. It was the kind of place once been a closed system became fully exposed and prestigious. The HOA's leadership unraveled quickly once formal oversight took control. At the center of that structure sat the homeowners association, some citing an entity that claimed to exist others remaining silent, thrived on compliance. Intensified. Its presence was everywhere and nowhere at once. Tasked not with notices arrived politely worded but unmistakably. The association's autonomy was suspended until compliance followed by thinly veiled threats of fines. The Karen's absence became noticeable. Most residents learned early that peace here didn't come from communications but from obedience. How patrols stopped. For a long time, the figure who had once dominated the neighborhood followed enforcement and intimidation vanished from public view, leaving behind a vacuum where authority once stood. Afternoons without her presence, to hear sprinklers ticking. That had shaped daily life settled into a calm that felt rehearsed. Financial audits confirmed the extent of misconduct and avoided lingering conversations that might drift into complaints. Manipulated, everyone knew oversight deliberately bypassed. Don't attract attention. Recovery efforts began immediately. The HOA thrived in that atmosphere. Accounts were restructured. Among the board members, dues were recalculated out. Residents received formal notices explaining the findings in plain language. Her authority came from visibility and persistence. The emotional response within the neighborhood was complex. Clipboard in hand, there was vindication, scanning for violations others had learned not to see. Once broken, she enforced rules not with restraint,
but
Many
enthusiasm.
residents struggled with the realization that
compliance
they
wasn't
had
just
lived
a
under an
duty,
abusive system
it was a personal
for so long
stand
without
that she believed
recognizing
everyone
it
else
fully.
had failed to
Others
meet.
grappled with
Over
guilt for
time,
remaining
residents
silent,
learned her
even when
patterns.
something felt wrong.
She favored
Yet
certain
alongside
homes,
those
ignored
emotions
others,
was a quiet
and
sense
seemed
of
especially
empowerment.
alert to anything
The
involving
outcome proved
guests.
that authority could be
Unfamiliar
challenged
cars
without
drew her
chaos,
attention.
that truth could
Laughter
prevail
carried
without
too long
aggression.
into the evening.
The process had been
outdoors.
slow,
Small
disciplined,
gatherings
and
became
grounded in
targets
evidence.
for scrutiny.
It demonstrated that
most people
accountability
endured
did
it
not
quietly.
require spectacle.
They told
The
themselves it
neighborhood
was easier
began to
not to
change in
resist.
subtle but
That
meaningful
mindset
ways.
held until the
HOA
night the police
meetings
arrived.
transformed from
The gathering
formalities into
itself
forums.
was unremarkable.
Attendance
A
remained
handful
high,
of guests,
but the tone
known
shifted.
faces,
Questions were
along the
encouraged.
curb.
Financial reports were
warm,
detailed
the
and
atmosphere
accessible.
relaxed.
Audits
It was
were
nothing
scheduled
more than an
regularly
ordinary
and published
evening
openly.
that happened countless
Rules
times
were
in other
revisited
neighborhoods
with
without
purpose.
consequence.
Those that
There was
existed
no
solely to
shouting,
control
no
were
music
removed.
spilling into the street,
Others were clarified to
disorder.
ensure fairness
Yet
and
within
consistency.
minutes,
Patrol cars
enforcement
appeared
was
at the end of the
standardized,
block, stripping
their presence
individuals of
transformed
unchecked
the night
discretion.
instantly.
The system,
Flashing lights
once built
reflected
around
off fear,
windshields and
was
windows,
reoriented toward
pulling neighbors to their
transparency.
curtains.
The moral
The
impact
calm
of the
dissolved into
experience
tension.
extended beyond
The visit
policy.
didn't last long,
It reshaped
but its
how
impact
residents
lingered.
viewed authority
The
itself.
reason for the call was
The
vague,
HOA was
framed
no
around
longer an
concerns
abstract
that didn't match
institution.
reality.
It was a
The
reminder
officers
that
left as
power is
quickly
only
as they
legitimate
arrived
when it is
their
a job
job done,
done, their time
structures
wasted.
designed to
What
protect
mattered
can easily
wasn't what
become
happened
tools
during
of
the
harm
visit.
if left unchecked.
It was what it
The police
represented.
department,
This wasn't an
misuse of
isolated
emergency
incident.
calls,
It was the
implemented
first
new
visible
protocols to
escalation in a
prevent
pattern
similar
that had been
abuses.
quietly forming.
Reports were
The
reviewed more
HOA,
carefully,
or more
patterns of
specifically its
repeated
most
calls from
aggressive
HOA
enforcer,
entities
had crossed an
received
invisible
additional
line.
scrutiny.
The rules had always
consequences
been
of
intrusive,
weaponizing public
but now they had
resources
brought
were
law
acknowledged
enforcement
openly.
into something that
As
never
normalcy
required it.
returned,
It
the next
carried a
morning,
different meaning.
the neighborhood returned
calm
to
that
its
settled
routine
over
as
the
if nothing
neighborhood
had
was
happened.
no longer enforced
Lawns were
silence.
watered.
It was
Cars
the absence
departed
of
on
fear.
schedule.
Guests'
Smiles
arrived
were
without
exchanged.
tension.
But
Conversations
beneath that
lingered.
surface, something had
Community
shifted.
spaces felt
Within
open again.
days, an
The
official
house that
notice
had once
arrived.
been targeted
It
became
referenced
unremarkable
community
once
standards,
more,
guest
blending
limits,
back into the
and
rhythm
vague
of
daily
behavioral
life.
expectations.
Its role in the
There was
story
no
was not
mention of the
celebrated
police,
publicly,
no
but it was
acknowledgement
understood
of the seriousness
privately.
of what had occurred.
Change had begun there.
The message was
not through
clear without
defiance,
being stated.
but through persistence.
This was a warning.
The moral
The
lesson
realization
of the
came
experience
slowly,
crystallized
settling
slowly.
in piece by piece.
Abuse of power
The
often
HOA
hides
wasn't
behind
responding
procedure
to
and
a problem.
politeness.
It was
It thrives
creating
in
one.
environments where
The police
questioning
call
is
wasn't about
discouraged and
safety,
complexity
it was
is
about
used as
intimidation.
a shield.
It was a
Confronting it
demonstration
requires
of
patience,
reach, a
not
reminder that
outrage.
the HOA could
Evidence,
escalate matters
not
beyond
emotion.
fines and letters
Community,
if it chose to.
not isolation.
Once that truth became
the
clear,
story became a
other
reference
moments
point beyond the
resurfaced with new
neighborhood.
meaning.
Other
Previous
HOAs took
warnings that
notice.
felt excessive.
Questions were asked
The way
elsewhere.
certain neighbors were left
Residents
alone
in
while
similar
others were
communities
scrutinized
began examining their own
The
associations
timing of
with
enforcement
renewed attention.
actions that always seemed to
Transparency
coincide
became
with
a topic
gatherings
of
or
discussion,
questions directed
not
at
an
the board.
inconvenience. The pattern was no
Karen's
longer
legacy,
ignorable.
though unspoken,
The HOA's
served
power
as a
rested on
cautionary
two
tale.
pillars:
Fear and
authority
ignorance.
rooted in intimidation
Fear kept
collapses when
residents
exposed.
Ignorance
Control
kept them
maintained
from
from
asking
asking
how
how
the
the
association
association
actually
actually
operated.
Her disappearance
Most people
did not
paid their
erase the
dues,
harm she
followed
caused,
the rules,
but it
and
ensured
never
it would
questioned
not
where the
continue.
money went or how
In the
decisions
end,
were made.
the resolution was
That
not
night
about
shattered the
punishment
illusion
alone.
of neutrality.
It was about
If the
restoration.
HOA was willing to
Restoring
involve
trust,
police over nothing,
restoring
then its
fairness,
leadership wasn't acting
restoring
in good
the
faith.
idea that community
That kind of
governance
confidence
exists to
didn't come
serve,
from
not
righteousness.
dominate. It came
The
from believing
experience
no
left
one
the
would ever
neighborhood
look too
wiser,
closely,
more vigilant,
the idea
and
of
less
looking
willing
deeper
to surrender
didn't begin as a
autonomy
plan.
without oversight.
It began as a question.
Silence was no longer
What
mistaken
gave them the
for
certainty
peace.
that they could act this
Compliance
way
was
without
no longer
consequence?
confused with harmony.
The answer,
The
whatever
moral
it was,
impact
had to
endured
be hidden
quietly,
somewhere, embedded in
and
daily
hidden
choices
things always
and collective
leave traces.
memory. The
From that
story
point
concluded
forward,
not with
everything
triumph,
was observed
but with
differently.
understanding. Notices
Power,
were saved
when left
instead of
unquestioned,
discarded.
corrodes.
Emails were archived
Truth,
instead of
when
skimmed.
pursued with care,
Timelines were
dismantles it.
reconstructed, and a single
Patterns
act
were
of
noted.
intimidation,
Small
intended to
details
silence,
that once felt
became the
insignificant
catalyst for a
began to
reckoning that
align into
reshaped
something
an entire
larger.
community. The neighborhood itself started to feel like a stage set, orderly on the surface, rigidly controlled, and carefully managed to prevent scrutiny. The HOA meetings, once sparsely attended, appeared intentionally dull, designed to discourage participation. Financial summaries were brief and technical, offering just enough information to appear compliant without revealing substance. The more attention was paid, the clearer it became that the police call was not a reaction, but
but a tactic. And tactics are used for a reason. That realization marked the true beginning of the story. Not the night of flashing lights, but the moment the belief in the HOA's legitimacy cracked. What had once been accepted as authority was now seen as something far more fragile. Power that depends on silence cannot survive curiosity. As the neighborhood settled back into its carefully maintained calm, a quiet decision took shape. The rules would still be followed. The notices would still arrive. The enforcer would continue her rounds, convinced of her dominance. But behind the scenes, something irreversible had begun. The HOA had revealed its willingness to abuse power. And that meant it had something to hide.